Learning from the wars of other nations is invaluable. Indeed, all questions about the evolution of war can be answered without expending your own blood and treasure. Consequently, militaries have sent officers to observe and report on foreign wars for centuries. The American Civil War was no exception, but the impact of these observations was muted. While the European missions gained some valuable insights on how the conflict in the United States was evolving the nature of gunpowder warfare, they'd be overshadowed by the contradictory lessons from Europe. However, this wouldn't become a problem until 1914. Welcome to our latest video on the American Civil War, in which we will devote a special episode to the European observers who came to watch the conflict and examine what they thought of the bloodiest battles ever fought on American soil. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible. Europe was fascinated by the American Civil War. During the 19th century, most people in Europe knew little about the United States, beyond its role in spreading the ideals that had led to the French Revolution in 1789 and the European revolutions of 1848, as well as whatever insights made it back from immigrant communities. While publicly most governments supported the Union and rejected the Confederacy over slavery, Europe's aristocrats privately hoped for a Southern victory. This was partially because they were more comfortable with the South's planted gentry than the Northern bourgeoisie. The main reason, however, was that if America's democracy failed, it would dampen their own democratic movements, protecting the conservative order. Additionally, the war came at an opportune time for Europe's militaries. The Crimean War and the Italian War of 1859 clearly showed that new technology was changing warfare, but it wasn't clear how. The Industrial Revolution hadn't reached all the nations in those conflicts, muting its impact. However, the American North was more industrialized than most of Europe, so surely they'd answer Europe's questions about industrialization's impact on war. Finally, this was the first opportunity for most of Europe to see how the Americans fought. Only the French, British, and Spanish actually saw them during their revolution, with the rest of Europe receiving second- or third-hand accounts of the war at best. When the United States fought Britain again in the War of 1812 and convincingly defeated Mexico in 1848, Europe had been too distracted by the Napoleonic Wars and domestic instability, respectively, to take notice. This was their first opportunity to learn the capabilities of a democratic army. While Abraham Lincoln was quick to welcome European observers to the north, he only begrudgingly allowed them to access the south. However, official observers enjoyed special diplomatic privileges, which forced his hand. Given Europe's fascination with the South, it could have caused a major diplomatic incident had he refused to allow observers to cross the battle lines or come through the blockade. Thus, they were allowed to travel freely. That said, not every European power cared about the American Civil War. The Kingdom of Italy had only been unified less than a month before the war began, and was too busy forming itself to care about a distant war. Managing the fallout from absorbing the Kingdom of Naples and the ongoing tension with the Pope were far higher priorities. Meanwhile, Austria's observers' reports weren't taken seriously. The United States and Austria had always had limited official contact, and the deeply conservative Austrian military was highly resistant to reform. Austria only reluctantly began modernizing its weaponry following its defeat in 1859, and the initial reports from its observers confirmed the conclusions reached from that war. The emperor and his leading generals consequently lost interest. To them, the American war was just a minor curiosity. Later reports raised serious questions about the readiness of the Austrian army for modern war. It would take a later defeat to force stronger reforms. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire sent formal observers to the United States, but it's not clear what, if any, lessons were learned. The Ottoman army had just gone through a very difficult period of modernization prior to the Crimean War. That war found the army still lacking, but there was little desire for more reform in the 1860s. As such, the Sublime Porte filed away and largely forgot the reports. Meanwhile, the Russians officially showed minimal interest in the war, but it wasn't from a lack of desire to learn from it. Russia had been shocked and humiliated by its defeat in the Crimean War, and was already undergoing military modernization, which wasn't going smoothly. All the Tsar's resources and energy were being spent pushing through the current round of martial and domestic reforms, which the deeply conservative Russian military and aristocracy were pushing back against. Incorporating new lessons from the Americans was officially unacceptable and out of the question. Unofficially, Russia was actively watching the war. In September 1863, Russian naval squadrons unexpectedly arrived in San Francisco and New York. While interpreted at the time as a show of support for the Union, in reality they were hiding from the British and French. Russia was afraid that France and/or Britain would intervene in the Polish January uprising and didn't want its fleet trapped in port again. While not an official mission, the Russians spent much of their time in the United States learning everything they could about coastal bombardment, maintaining and running blockades, and building ironclads. The Russian Navy became enamored by the USS Monitor, as it was exactly the ship they'd wanted against the British and French Baltic fleets. Post-war, Russia bought a number of Passaic-class monitors directly from John Ericsson. While the army was modernizing along French and Prussian lines, some American influence snuck in. Russia's first modern breech-loading rifles were American designs. During the 1870s, the Russian cavalry would be reformed, and a prolonged battle developed between those who wanted American-style independent cavalry divisions and those who wanted to maintain the traditional shock cavalry regiments. Ultimately, some units became carbine-armed deep penetration raiders and scouts, while others retained their sabers and lances, leading to considerable confusion about cavalry's role in the Russian military. There was no evidence that Helmut von Moltke called the American Civil War two armed mobs chasing each other around the country, from which nothing can be learned, and it would have been deeply out of character. Moltke knew that complacency had led Prussia to disaster during the Napoleonic Wars, and cultivated curiosity within the Prussian General Staff to ensure it never missed military advancements again. Consequently, he made sure to send an official mission and encouraged junior officers to take leave and observe the conflict themselves. France felt similarly, and early on sent numerous officers to observe the war, many of which served on George McClellan's staff during the Peninsular Campaign. In 1864, an official mission was dispatched to study the Army of the Potomac's logistical system, though it was more limited than most due to rising tensions over France's invasion of Mexico. France and Prussia would ultimately come to the same conclusion. While both North and South had a remarkable ability to rapidly build armies, their conflict was so unlike anything that could happen in Europe that the lessons didn't apply to Europe. The most widely read reports came from Prussian captain Justus Scheibert, though his military conclusions were shared by all the French and Prussian observers. Scheibert praised Southern officers effusively, to the point of hero-worshipping Robert E. Lee. However, he tempered his bias by noting that the North's industrial capacity ensured its long-term victory, and praised the inter-service cooperation between the US Army and Navy. He and the French were also impressed by the professionalism and efficiency of American artillery crews, and admired the enthusiasm, determination, and endurance of the American soldier. That said, the core of all the observers' works was about the differences between Europe and America. Both delegations agreed that the United States' lack of a standing army and a large professional officer corps ensured a long and bloody war. Scheibert was impressed by the volunteer soldiers and officers' ability to learn on the job, but argued that they shouldn't have had to. Europe's highly trained and disciplined conscripts, led by professionals, would have won the war quickly through a few decisive field battles. As the war dragged on, and battles increasingly revolved around field fortifications and siegecraft, he said that it was a natural result of insufficiently trained officers being unable to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The French noted that America's geography was far larger and more rugged than Europe's, which made European tactics and strategy impossible. France, Sardinia, and Austria had concentrated 350,000 soldiers in Lombardy during the 1859 war, a province roughly the same size as the state of New Hampshire. It was considered dangerously unwise to separate individual armies by more than 50 kilometers in Europe. Yet the Union's armies fought independently along a front over 1,500 kilometers long. This was necessary, but it dispersed the armies too much to win any battle decisively. European armies fought using concentrated artillery to disrupt formations, followed by infantry using fire and advance tactics, before finishing with a decisive bayonet charge. Shock cavalry would then rout the enemy, while light cavalry pursued to finish them off, conclusively winning the battle. These tactics worked because European battles took place in open fields and meadows, with long sightlines. But America was primarily hilly woodlands. It was rare for the enemy to be visible beyond 100 meters, limiting artillery's ability to disrupt formations. Infantry was forced to fight prolonged slugfests, unthinkable in Europe, and even if the Americans had heavy cavalry, it would have been wasted on broken terrain. Therefore, they concluded that the American Civil War didn't model European wars and offered few insights. As the only European power with extensive holdings in North America, Great Britain had a more urgent interest in the American Civil War. The two nations had already fought 2 wars and nearly came to blows over a border dispute in 1859. As future conflict was still highly possible, the British observed the war closely. 2 official military missions studied Union industry, fortifications, and artillery, while quietly assessing the prowess of their potential enemy. Additionally, numerous journalists and officers arrived to observe and report on the war. Their extensive reports produced mixed results. While the British public was strongly pro-Union, the pro-Southern aristocracy was far more interested in the South. Both the journalists and some officers responded, with many of the widest read reports being human interest pieces on Southern culture. Most famously, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle wrote extensively while traveling through 9 of the 11 Confederate states and observing the Battle of Gettysburg. His best-selling book, 3 Months in the Southern States, strongly praised the Southern people and reads like a travelogue rather than a war report. The more militarily useful results both reassured and disquieted London. On the one hand, the reports on industrialized logistics, modern weaponry, and command developments all confirmed lessons learned from the British Army's poor showing in the Crimean War. Consequently, new urgency was placed on ongoing reforms and the modernization program. Of course, the Army's program was largely eclipsed by the Royal Navy's rush to replace its wooden ships following the Battle of Hampton Roads. On the other hand, many observers were shocked at how quickly the United States went from barely any military to one comparable to the Continental Standing Armies. They warned that the United States could raise, train and equip an army capable of conquering British North America before London could respond. This reinforced London's existing policy of avoiding confrontation with the United States. Colonel Henry Fletcher further warned in his reports and book, History of the American War, that this American army was far more dangerous than it appeared. While it appeared undisciplined and amateurish by European standards, it was adapting and learning from its mistakes far more quickly than a European army could. Europe's officer corps was drawn from the aristocracy, while the rank and file was largely filled from the poorest of the poor. The middle classes largely shunned and were shunned by the military establishment. All decision-making came from the top down, and despite their professionalism, European armies remained rigidly rooted in tradition. The Union Army was egalitarian, drawing from all classes into all ranks. The average American soldier had far more education than his British counterpart, and this meant that the army was learning from both the top down and the bottom up. Consequently, this democratic army recognized that battlefield conditions and improved artillery made rigid formations useless, and adopted looser and more mobile formations. Their preference for fighting from natural cover and prepared fortifications was the logical adaptation to the deadlier modern weapons. This had, in turn, placed more decision-making responsibility on American junior officers, sergeants, and individual soldiers, yet they rose to the challenge. There had been no formal decision to adopt these tactics, but it had naturally spread throughout both armies. This would never be allowed to happen in a European army, and Fletcher argued this was a major weakness on Europe's part. 19th century European wars were fought for fairly limited political ends, while America's war was a fight to the death between nations. Britain's all-volunteer professional army was perfect for limited conflicts and colonial wars. However, if it had to fight a total war like the Americans did, this army would be rapidly depleted. Britain would have to form a new army from new volunteers and conscripts, just like the Americans were. Therefore, Fletcher argued that mandatory military service should be implemented for all classes, to prepare the currently unmilitary British public for future wars. He also advocated for raising public education and physical fitness standards to match what he saw in America, with a particular need for West Point-style comprehensive officer training. When the total war finally arrived, Britain would need a much larger pool of trained and capable recruits. Unlike many reform-minded observers, something came from Fletcher's observations, as the Royal Military College of Canada was explicitly established thanks to his writings. However, for the most part, Europe continued on as if it had learned nothing from the American Civil War. The idea that Europe should have done so barely existed until scholars in the 1930s sought to explain why Europe destroyed itself during the Great War. Basil Liddell Hart and J.F.C. Fuller led the charge, arguing that Britain should have realized that future wars would follow the American Civil War's example. However, this wouldn't have made sense at the time. That the American Civil War foreshadowed World War I is obvious in retrospect, but at the time, the American conflict was completely overshadowed by the German Unification Wars. In 1864, Prussia easily won the Second Schleswig War. Then, in 1866, it resoundingly defeated Austria in a month. In 1870, Prussia humiliated France and the German Empire was born. The subsequent 1877 Russo-Turkish War further reinforced the idea that European wars were won quickly and decisively, through large standing armies, superior technology, strategy and railways, and could be kept limited through diplomatic means. Thus, in the short run, the Franco-Prussian conclusion was proven correct. The American Civil War didn't apply to Europe. Unlike that long and grinding war, European wars actually were quick and decisive. It wasn't until Europe finally fought a true total war that anyone asked if it could have learned from the Americans a half-century earlier. By then, of course, it was too late. More videos on the American Civil War are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.